Welcome, everyone. Dear guests, I am honored to invite on stage the Vice President Director of the Common Sense Society, a recognized researcher and writer who will tell us all about the history of Polish-American relations. Please welcome Dr. Paul Coyer.
No water. Thank you very much. So I promise not to be as controversial as Dr. Zybertovich. He's a great guy. I've had lunches with him that are a lot of fun, but I've never seen him speak in public, and he's a pretty entertaining guy. I'm a historian. How many of you in school liked history? Yes, at least some of you. For those of you that didn't, I apologize. It means you probably had a very bad teacher. History can be so fun if you understand how it relates to today, if it's more important to you than just names and dates and places of boring people that died 400 years ago. So I promise you this will be more interesting. So Poles have always seemed to share an affinity for America that is deeper than that held by most Europeans. One that's based on an underlying body of shared values and a similarly strong, historically rooted sense of identity and national purpose. When I travel to Europe, I feel like I can let my hair down, so to speak, in Poland. I feel like I'm at home. Because Poles tend to share my belief in the importance of things like family, tradition, faith, the historic values of Western civilization, and our shared cultural heritage and traditions, which have given the world democratic governance, the rule of law, prosperity, unprecedented historical levels of prosperity, and beauty, especially so much beauty in the arts and literature. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that the three main pillars that drive my own organization, the Common Sense Society, liberty, prosperity, and beauty, have likewise heavily shaped the history of Polish-American relations. We'll see that as we talk about it. Europeans were asked in a recent poll which country was most important to their own. Most, as you might imagine, named Germany. Poles, however, named the United States. Good choice. The transatlantic alliance was based upon the shared values I just summarized, and has remained critical to most Poles at a time when many others in Europe today have been openly questioning it. The war in Ukraine has further strengthened the Polish belief in the importance of the United States to Polish security, and Poland has become to a very significant degree, I think, America's indispensable ally in this region, Central and Eastern Europe. Yet the affinity that each has for the other is far deeper than mere strategic intent and strategic imperative. Poles have played a special interest in my own life, starting from childhood in Wisconsin. My family's nearest neighbors as I was growing up was an elderly Polish couple from Chicago. You all, I'm sure, know that there are more Poles in Chicago than in Warsaw. And they would come up north to Wisconsin when I was a kid, and they would feed me pierogies, kiełbasa, and the elderly Polish gentleman, when my parents weren't looking, would try to slip me some vodka. I was only 10. My parents didn't like that. I thought it was fun. Naturally, being curious from an early age about other languages and cultures, I asked the Polish lady to teach me Polish. She refused and said, "Polish is too difficult, don't bother." Anyway, today I blame her for the fact that I still don't speak Polish, so perhaps you all can help me rectify that on this and future trips. So members of that couple's family would visit Chicago and tell stories about their activities under German and Soviet occupation during the Second World War, about blowing up railroads, various other stories of adventure and sacrifice and determination in the face of two simultaneous occupations by totalitarian regimes. Those stories sparked in my imagination and spawned a lifelong respect for the Polish national character. So the history of Polish-American relations begins, perhaps unsurprisingly, at the beginning. How many of you knew that the Poles were in Jamestown really at the beginning? Anybody know that before? They were there in 1608, a year after the colony began. And there's been a debate over the nature of the historical evidence regarding their presence in Jamestown. Some people have said, for instance, that Poles taught Americans the game of baseball. I'm sorry, but they did not. But that's a claim you hear. So you have to dig as a historian into the evidence and see what the true evidence is, what it actually points to. And after you get past the questionable claims, you still find that the Poles weren't just present in Jamestown, but they played a really significant role in that colony's success. Captain John Smith, the leader of the Jamestown colony in 1608 and 1609, was an international man of mystery who had developed a deep respect for the Poles during his adventures in Europe over the previous years. And it was due to him that they were there. Smith had been what you call an international man of mystery, a soldier of fortune, maybe a mercenary. He'd actually been a pirate in the Mediterranean for about a year or two, where he made a lot of money. And he had earned his title of English gentleman by beheading 3 Turkish soldiers in a row in single-armed combat in a no-man's land between the Austrian and the Turkish armies. This guy was what might be called, well, a badass. We don't have time to go into as many colorful stories of his life here, but suffice it to say that if someone like John Smith respected the Poles, they had earned it. So the first Poles, well, I should add as well that John Smith, after he beheaded those Turks, he ended up being taken captive about a year or two later by the Turks, losing a battle. He was sold into slavery. He ended up in Istanbul. He escaped by killing his master, and his escape route took him through Poland, and he got to know the Poles in Poland. That's where they won his respect. The first Poles arrived in Jamestown a year after Captain John Smith arrived. They got there in 1608, 12 years before the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. Evidence indicates that Smith had known at least 2 of them when he was in Poland previously, and he had suggested them due to their skill in manufacturing certain commodities, glass and other things, that were to be used both for trade with England and for use to help the colony prosper. Smith wrote later condemning the general laziness of the first English colonists, but he praised the Poles for their work ethic. The Poles leveraged their unique skill sets a few years later to undertake a labor strike with the goal of obtaining equal civil liberties with the English, including the vote. And the rights were given them in exchange for them training others in how to make glass and the other things that they did so that the colony could continue to thrive after that. Thus, it was actually Poles who first undertook a labor strike in defense of civil liberties in what became the United States and who first successfully fought to expand the vote. The Poles were also actively involved in the defense of the colony from the threat of hostile Native Americans. And John Smith records that on one occasion, 2 of them saved his life when he was under personal attack. One of them we know lost his life in an Indian attack, and one of them captured an Indian elder. So we see a significant Polish contribution to prosperity and liberty in what would later become the United States, even at the very beginning in Jamestown. But the Poles would play a much bigger role in the American Revolution. So John Kennedy, I'm sure you all know who he was. He toured Poland when he was 22 years old in 1939, just before the Nazi and the Soviet joint invasion. He later noted that, quote, not only America, but the whole world is indebted to Poles who have been fighting and dying for centuries in the cause of freedom everywhere. Perhaps nowhere has this been more strongly evident than in the Polish record of helping to birth my own country, the United States, in the 1770s and 1780s. I'm sure you all know this history, but I'll tell you anyway. The Americans don't know this, but many of you do. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had, shortly before the start of the American Revolution, been the victim of the first partition. I'm sure you all know what that was. Catherine the Great in Russia, Prussia, the Habsburg Empire, each took significant portions of Polish lands, and each began a process of carving up Poland that would lead eventually, by 1775, to the third partition and to the complete loss of Polish statehood. So having experienced the depredations of oppressive empires infringing on their sovereignty and independence, many Poles immediately felt an affinity for the American cause, and several Poles played major roles in supporting this cause. 2 names you probably know, and one I'm guessing you probably don't. The first, Tadeusz Kościuszko. Did I say that right? You know who that is? He studied engineering at the military academy here in Warsaw, as well as civil engineering in Paris, and motivated both by love of liberty and a broken heart due to a failed romance, arrived in Philadelphia in 1776 to offer his services to the American cause, whereupon Benjamin Franklin, who had just a couple months before had helped to write the Declaration of Independence, met him, interviewed him, and was thoroughly impressed and recommended that he be commissioned as an officer in the American Continental Army and put to use as an engineer. So on August 30th, grasping Franklin's recommendation in one hand, he walked into what's today known as Independence Hall, was then known as the Pennsylvania State House, He met the Continental Congress, and John Hancock appointed him a colonel in the Continental Army that October, and the rest, as they say, is history. He was said by the American General Horatio Gates, the victor at the Battle of Saratoga, to have been the true mastermind behind the American victory there, due to his use of geography and civil engineering to shape the battlefield in Americans' favor. That victory, as you probably know, converted what at times looked to be a lost cause into a world war that gave France the excuse it was looking for to openly enter the war on the American side and became a major turning point in the war. Kosciuszko was responsible for the construction of the impregnable fortifications of West Point. Those fortifications he designed frustrated the British plans to separate and use their superior naval power to separate the American colonies by taking control of the Hudson River, and that then caused the British to try to, with their spies, John Andre, the chief of their military spy unit, to try to turn the American General Benedict Arnold, which they succeeded in doing, but they never got control of West Point. A statue of Kosciuszko still stands on the grounds at West Point overlooking the Hudson River. He also played a key role in General Nathan Greene's Southern campaign in the Carolinas, serving as Greene's chief engineer, where he twice saved American forces from potential destruction by helping the Army to cross rivers, putting space between them and the British. At a time when other foreigners came to the U.S. looking for fame and fortune and glory, Kosciuszko was quiet, humble, and never sought his own advancement. When he was promoted, it was entirely due to his own admirable skills and a personal character that won the respect with all the American founders with whom he came into contact. Thomas Jefferson valued his friendship despite the fact that Kosciuszko openly and strongly criticized his holding of slaves and pointed out the inconsistency and indeed the hypocrisy of fighting for liberty while denying others their own liberty. Jefferson later wrote of Kosciuszko that, quote, "He is as pure a son of liberty as I've ever known." And to underline that despite the shared values that unite us and underpin our two nations, we Americans have nevertheless always struggled with the Polish language. George Washington was said to have pronounced and written Kosciuszko's name in at least 11 different ways, as did every one of the American founders who knew him, Jefferson included. Today, statues of him stand not only at West Point, but at several other locations, including at the intersection of 18th Street and Ben Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, and near the White House in Lafayette Park. I was just there last week. I had pictures on my cell phone. If any of you want to see that, I've got pictures of him and Pulaski, who's also there, right across the street from the White House. So the second name I just mentioned is Casimir Pulaski. I'm sure you know who he was. He became known as the father of the American cavalry, and his American admirers also called him a soldier of liberty. Pulaski had honed his skills in fighting in cavalry, fighting the Russians. You may notice a recurrent theme here, fighting the Russians, with his father. After being forced to flee Poland, he ended up in Paris, where late in 1776, he too met Ben Franklin and a guy named Silas Deane, both of whom had just arrived there as American envoys. Franklin was thus involved in ushering two of Poland's most famous heroes into America's service. In his letter recommending him to George Washington, Franklin described Pulaski as an officer famous throughout all of Europe for his bravery and conduct in defense of the liberty of his country. Upon arriving in the U.S., Pulaski then wrote a letter to Washington explaining his purposes for fighting. He wrote, "I came here where freedom is being defended, to serve it and to live or die for it." At the Battle of Brandywine in September 1777, the fate of revolution actually owed itself to the actions of Pulaski. The British were threatening to cut off the American army's retreat and capture Washington personally and his whole command. Washington, perhaps uncharacteristically, was completely frozen and didn't know what to do. Pulaski took 30 of George Washington's personal guard and led them on a reconnaissance mission and found an escape route. And then Washington used that to lead an organized retreat that saved himself and his army to live to fight another day. Pulaski spent that winter suffering the same deprivations as did the rest of Washington's army at Valley Forge. In 1778, with Washington's support and congressional approval, he was named Brigadier General and authorized to recruit, train, and lead a unit of cavalry and infantry, which he branded Pulaski's Legion, which he then used to wreak havoc on the British. The next year, in May 1779, he helped to save the city of Charleston, South Carolina, from surrendering to the British, and he died that October in wounds sustained in attempting to retake Savannah, Georgia. Pulaski has cast a long shadow in American consciousness. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, famous American poet, commemorated him in verse. Fort Pulaski National Monument stands today honoring his sacrifice in Savannah, Georgia. And since 1929, General Pulaski Memorial Day has been observed by presidential decree on October the 11th of each year since 1929. It was just last month. So not as well known as Pulaski and Kosciuszko, but just as important to the success of the revolution was a third gentleman from Poland. He was a Polish Jew named Chaim Solomon. Little known or remembered today, but without his financial support and acumen, the American cause, which already faced long odds, would never have survived. Solomon immigrated to New York City in his early 30s, just as the rebellion against the British was beginning. And he immediately joined something called the Sons of Liberty, a secret society opposed to continued British rule. He was fluent in 8 languages, and those language skills, combined with his financial acumen, provided critical support to the American cause. He sold supplies to the Hessian mercenaries. He simultaneously spied on them. He helped American and later French prisoners of war to escape British custody. He bribed foreign mercenaries to leave British service and did many other things that are worthy of a major motion picture. When he was captured by the British after they finally figured out what was going on, legend has it that he escaped capture by bribing his Hessian guard. The British seized his assets in New York, and upon escape to Philadelphia, he did what all resilient people do. He started over from absolutely nothing. He worked closely with a guy named Robert Morris, who's known as the financier of the American Revolution, who depended on Solomon to keep the American cause afloat. Solomon sold U.S. government bonds at a time when no one had any faith in the U.S. government's ability to repay their bonds by endorsing in them with his own personal credit and reputation. And you have to think at this time, the American government was brand new. It had no credit history. Nobody respected it. No one trusted. Everyone knew we didn't have any money. So this guy basically kept us afloat pretty much single-handedly. When no one else would buy loans, even with his personal endorsement, he loaned the money himself to the American cause. Between 1781 and 1784, he personally loaned $650,000 to the American cause. That's the same of about $14 million today. Many of the American founders personally got loans from Solomon for which they were charged 0 or very low interest. A young James Madison, who borrowed from Solomon, complained later that Solomon obstinately rejects all recompense. He tried to pay him some interest. Perhaps more importantly, when George Washington needed to march south to liaise with the French in what became known as the Battle of Yorktown, Virginia, the Continental Army was in no financial shape to do so. We were completely bankrupt. The Army hadn't been paid in weeks, if not months. They were close to mutiny. They had virtually no food. They had half the weaponry they needed, not the clothing they needed. And George Washington depended on Solomon to raise the money necessary. Solomon came up with the money, I think about $20,000 at the time, and that enabled George Washington to march south to meet the French, and that ended the revolution. Solomon ended up dying at the young age of 44, just a year and a half after the peace treaty was signed, as a result of tuberculosis that he had contracted while in a British prisoner of war ship. Today on Wacker Drive in Chicago, a statue of him stands next to George Washington and Robert Morris. So after the American Revolution, Kosciuszko, as you all probably know, led a failed uprising against Russian depredations in 1794, which failed, of course. Russian power was too great, following which Poland experienced a third partition and ceased to exist. Kosciuszko, who had been captured, wounded on the battlefield, was imprisoned and then allowed to immigrate to the United States, where he was met upon arrival in Philadelphia by huge crowds. They put him on his shoulders, they had a big band. They treated him as a conquering hero, which he was. Now, at various points over the next 100 to 120 years, the Poles would attempt armed uprising, usually in the Russian partition zone, which are always defeated. One such uprising took place in 1830 and 1831. Started in November 1830, it was called the November Uprising, following which 235 of these Polish patriots escaped to the United States, with 43 coming to Texas. Now, while I may not be Texan by birth, my grandfather was a cowboy in Texas, and any red-blooded patriotic American loves what Texas stands for. In fact, I wanted to wear my hat and my boots, but I decided that I would rather be more sophisticated and wear a suit and shoes, maybe next time. So, Poles helped to make Texas, Texas, and nobody realizes this. This is one of the neat stories of history that are so interesting. So these Polish immigrants had fought against Russia. They had trained in the military academy here in Warsaw, and some had experience in the Napoleonic Wars as well. They proved critical to General Sam Houston's ability to train his men, the vast majority of whom were simple farmers who had no military training whatsoever. And the Poles helped him shape them into some semblance of a fighting force, that they were somewhat effective against the Mexicans. It's interesting to know the Battle of San Jacinto, in which the Mexican General Santa Anna was defeated and captured, ensuring Texas independence, deserves particular attention for a number of reasons. Number one, the river from which the battle took its name was named for a Polish saint, Saint Jacek. San Jacinto in Spanish, who had been canonized in 1594. When the Spanish discovered the river while exploring Texas later in the 1590s, they named the river after the most recently canonized saint, who by an accident of history just happened to be Polish. So one can therefore be forgiven for believing that it was perhaps providential that the Poles, approximately 240 years later, played a key role in winning the battle that was named after a Polish saint and that ensured Texas independence. One Pole in particular comes in for special recognition due to his actions at that Texas victory. Colonel Andrzej Felix Wardzinski. One Texas history asserts that Colonel Wardzinski, who came up with the idea of blowing up a bridge that could have allowed Santa Anna an avenue of escape, thus ensured that Santa Anna was trapped and the battle would result in a devastating defeat for the Mexicans and victory for the Texans. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, however, Santa Anna had escaped and he was wearing peasant clothing and he was trying to get away. His hope was to go back to Mexico, raise a large Mexican army, come back, and he probably would have made short work of the Texans because they were a few hundred, like I said, poorly armed and poorly trained farmers, basically. So, however, here too, the Pole, Wardzinski, played a key role, and his patrol captured Santa Anna and ended the threat. So, during the rest of the 19th and early 20th century, Polish lands were legally part of other countries, but the Polish struggle to reclaim independence and sovereignty was always at the forefront of Polish consciousness. The changes in international order brought about by the First World War, and many times we'll have a panel after this on geopolitics and the changes, the tectonic shifts that we're seeing in geopolitics and the international order today. When you have dramatic changes as we're seeing today and as we did then, both good and bad things can happen. Back then, a little over 100 years ago, one of the very good things that took place is Poland won its statehood back. And the changes in international order basically brought about the fulfillment of that long-held hope. There wasn't much hope for it before the war. As this audience is probably uniquely aware, an independent sovereign Polish state was the 13th of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, in which Wilson articulated his aims for the post-war world. How that came to be, as you are all probably also aware in this room, is largely the work of a virtuoso pianist and composer, Ignacy Jan Paderewski, with whom love of beauty and the love of the arts combined with a love of liberty in a really unique way. Paderewski wrote the only opera, Manru, by a Polish composer that has ever been performed in the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And he did a lot of other things to help the arts in the United States. He undertook a number of musical tours. He funded himself in 1896 a scholarship for young American classical music composers to encourage classical music composition in the United States. And he was known among American elites as the Polish virtuoso statesman. Prior to the First World War, the prospects for Polish independence were not that great. Theodore Roosevelt had been familiar with Poland's affairs and supportive of its attempt to get statehood back. But Woodrow Wilson, especially early in his presidency, was not so familiar with Poland, and frankly, he wasn't that sympathetic to the Polish cause. In fact, in Wilson's 1905 History of the United States, he completely ignored the contributions of people like Pulaski and Kosciuszko to American history. And its lone reference to Poles in America was a somewhat dismissive reference to them as a recent, and Wilson implied not very important, addition to the American nation. But the war, like I said, brought about conditions that caused Americans to rethink this. And it changed Wilson's attitude in particular, but through Paderewski, as we'll see. Polish lands, which were a battleground at the time between the Germans, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were devastated. And attention paid to this issue by the American press triggered American public appreciation for the long-standing struggle of the Poles to regain their independence and sovereignty and control over their own destiny. Paderewski played a critical role in building support in Poland's cause through his carefully cultivated friendship with someone named Colonel Edward House, who was Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor, and through House, he gained entree to Wilson himself. By the time of America's entry into the war, largely due to Paderewski's influence, Wilson's attitude toward Poland had changed to the point that the American government had authorized the recruitment of a large number of Poles in the American army. Between 200 and 230,000 Poles were with the American military in France and Europe as a whole by 1918. Because of Paderewski, the Wilson administration was treating him as a spokesman of a not yet existent Polish government in exile, and Wilson had, as I've mentioned, made Polish independence the 13th of his 14 points. Following the war, the U.S. largely withdrew from European affairs. Europe, as you may know, was always seen in the American consciousness as kind of a cesspit of conflicting interests, of amoral geopolitics. The Europeans were always getting into messes and fighting themselves for things that we didn't understand, and the American people were kind of tired of it. So at the end of World War I, we kind of retracted ourselves from global affairs. That ended up having a negative impact on Poland's attempt to regain its statehood. We had supported their statehood, but after that, we didn't give them the support they needed. The U.S. Food Administration worked to alleviate the famine in Poland, but other than that, the government, despite Wilson's support for the reestablishment of Polish statehood at the Versailles Conference, showed a relative lack of concern and support for Poland's struggle to reassert its independence. So at this critical juncture, Poles, despite having just regained their country, facing famine, a country devastated by war, with their borders as yet undefined, and the country's administration dependent upon civil servants of Polish descent who had served in the bureaucracies of the former occupying powers, staying on the job to help their country get on its feet. The Poles did something that remains unrecognized as a critical event in world history. They saved Europe from Soviet occupation and the scourge of communism, what Paderewski termed in a letter to Colonel House, this barbarous movement, and thereby saved Western civilization itself in 1919 and 1920. They did so not with the help of the US government, unfortunately, but that of a few Americans at what was known as the Kosciuszko Squadron. I'm sure you've all heard of the 1933 Hollywood classic King Kong, right? Any of you have seen the newer version of that movie? It's a great movie. I like the old one, despite the fact it looks very cheesy. It's a classic. I love it. How many of you knew that the movie is not just about a gigantic gorilla climbing the Empire State Building and fighting off fighter planes like they're flies? It's actually about the nature of beauty, and there's a reason for that. Marion Cooper was very concerned about the nature of beauty. So that film was produced and directed by Marion C. Cooper. He was an American with no Polish ancestry who nevertheless had a deep love for Poland. And the reason why was that he was a direct lineal descendant of somebody named John Cooper. John Cooper was a regimental commander in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and he had fought with Pulaski in Savannah, Georgia in 1779. Family lore held it that John Cooper had carried a mortally wounded Pulaski from the battlefield and passed on that story with a sense of obligation to Poland for its sacrifice in the American cause down through the generations. Now, Marion Cooper had studied at the U.S. Naval Academy, fought with distinction in the First World War as a fighter pilot, then a bomber pilot. And Herbert Hoover's December 1918 essay, Appeal to World Conscience, published in the New York Times, highlighted the dire situation in Poland. Cooper sought out service in Hoover's U.S. Food Administration, specifically to repay what he knew to be a longstanding American debt to Poland and a family debt. Due to the fact that Poland was a major battleground in the war, as I've just talked about, its industry, its infrastructure, and the arable land had been decimated, resulting in a famine, at the height of which nearly 1.5 million Polish children every day were being fed by the US government. Lviv, at that time an important center of Polish culture, was a military center also for Józef Pilsudski, and particularly was in dire need, and Cooper was placed in charge of the American efforts in Galicia and specifically in Lviv in February 1919, arriving just in the midst of a Bolshevik war to take over that part of Galicia. Cooper immediately gained a reputation for providing assistance in the midst of a highly dangerous situation without regard for his own safety. He saw the necessity for Polish-American cooperation to halt the expansion of Bolshevism in Central and Eastern Europe. So after working for the Food Administration for about 3 months, Cooper, who is described by one historian as the man with the soul of a lion and the morals of a knight, decided that he could better serve his aim and helping to build Polish air power and defend Polish by fighting. So he sent a letter to Józef Pilsudski on 29th of April 1919 in which he explained his family's ties with Pulaski. He wrote that, "My family considers it my duty, as is also my sincere wish, to offer my services to Poland during the period of her fight for freedom. And my only request is to be assigned to forces in actual work at the front, regardless of my rank. So he and another American, a General Cedric Fauntleroy, joined a recently created fighter squadron called the 7th Fighter Squadron, that with the influx of Americans that followed, that Fauntleroy and Cooper both recruited, was named by Cooper the Kosciuszko Squadron. Fauntleroy commanded with Cooper as his deputy. The insignia of the squadron symbolizes American-Polish unity and cooperation with 13 red and white vertical stripes taken from the American flag, with red and white also both being in the American and the Polish flag, and encircled by 13 stars representing the original 13 American colonies. These American volunteers took action in contravention to both U.S. State Department and War Department policy. So in the face of almost complete opposition of the Wilson administration, these guys did what they did anyway because they thought it was the right thing to do. So between 16 and 20 Americans, mostly World War I volunteers and veterans, flew with the squadron. 3 were killed in action. 10, including Cooper, were given the Virtutu Militari Award by the Polish government. And the story of Cooper and Kosciuszko Squadron has a movie actually that's coming out in the next year or two, I believe. It's under production. And the story is the stuff of movies, so I can't wait for the movie to come out. It's filled with romance, with daring do, with passion, with pathos and love of liberty, and action, of course. The squadron punched well above its weight and made a major contribution to the miracle of the Vistula by attacking and scattering a very formidable Polish cavalry, and thus helping to beat back Lenin's hordes and to keep communism from infecting a frustrated and defeated Germany and spreading through the whole of Europe. Cooper was shot down a month before the battle outside the gates of Warsaw here and was taken prisoner. The Poles saw that he was shot down and they thought he was dead. Several months later, he was taken prisoner of war. He ends up in Moscow. Several months later, he comes back to Poland, back from the dead from the Polish perspective, and he receives a hero's welcome. Big crowds, big brass bands. The Polish government give him their highest honor. They offered to give him a mansion, a manor house with an estate, and a lifelong stipend, a lifelong income. Cooper refused graciously. He reminded the Polish government that Kosciuszko was offered the same thing, and Kosciuszko also declined and said, "My only recompense is that I was privileged enough to be allowed to fight for your liberty." Paderewski, to get back to Paderewski, he died while on a conducting tour of the United States in June 1941, as Poland was once again occupied by hostile powers, and was temporarily buried in Arlington National Cemetery. After the fall of communism, his body was transferred here to Warsaw, although his heart, encased in a bronze sculpture, remains in the United States, symbolizing, even in his death, the bond between the United States and Poland. Today, we see a somewhat similar theme in defense of liberty: a united Polish effort in the face of aggressive Russian actions, this time in Ukraine, and a historically familiar echo of a potential Russian threat to Poland, which is now a member of NATO. As I mentioned, the Polish-American bond is based upon much more than mere geopolitical necessity. As I've also mentioned at the outset of this talk, liberty, prosperity, and beauty, the 3 primary values that animate the Common Sense Society, are prominent themes in the history of Polish-American relations. We have each, throughout our histories, contributed significantly to both the winning and the sustenance of liberty on behalf of the other, and contributed to economic prosperity of the other, from Jamestown through to today. Going forward to John Paul II, as one example of winning liberty, we see that, pardon me, my pages are not correctly numbered. The spiritual connection between U.S. President Ronald Reagan and a Polish Pope, John Paul II, I think is a very powerful illustration of the Polish-American collaboration in defense of liberty and of this resilient role of faith in our respective societies. In 1979, before Reagan and John Paul II had even met, 1 million Poles suffering under communist oppression had met for a mass with the Pope and had chanted in the face of their atheist oppressors, "We want God." That determination to remain faithful to their spiritual calling as a nation resonated with a man who would soon enter the White House. Both Reagan and John Paul shared near-death experiences at the hand of assassins within weeks of each other in the spring of 1981. Both met a year later and discussed in person that they both believed that God had spared their lives for what they saw as a spiritual cause, defeating communist totalitarianism that enslaved both the Polish people as well as much of the world since the Second World War. Both saw the struggle for human liberty and prosperity in fundamentally spiritual terms and believed that spiritual reality was tightly intertwined with political and economic reality. Nancy Reagan later said that John Paul II had been her husband's best friend, such was the bond between them. Now, while that friendship and the joint crusade of these two men against Soviet communism was in many ways historically unique, it is also reflective of the broad sweep of the history of Polish-American relations. Now, Reagan and John Paul were far more successful than they likely dreamt possible when they first spoke in the early 1980s. And as we now know, by the end of that decade, communism was crumbling. With its fall, the United States went to work to help Poland build a market economy, with prominent Americans such as former Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and former Director of the New York Stock Exchange John Whitehead, Harvard Professor of International Trade Jeffrey Sachs providing extensive support, George H.W. Bush Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady and Undersecretary David Mulford, successfully advocating for large-scale debt reduction for Poland, which helped it to get on its feet and to build prosperity. So today, again, we see a somewhat similar theme in defense of liberty. We are again united in defense of liberty with Russian aggression, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago. And we see that the themes of liberty, prosperity, and beauty continue to be evident in Poland today. From the music and on the beauty end of things, from the music of Paderewski to the connection with Marian Cooper, and the many, many Poles who've been involved in the arts in the United States, including one painter, Joseph Mazur, who shares a surname with Michael Mazur. I haven't asked Michael if he's a relative, but I hope so. From the struggle to save the Jamestown colony to build a thriving economy and expand political liberty there, to the Polish contribution to America's long-shot bid for independence, to the fight for Texan independence from Mexico, to the reconstitution of Polish statehood following World War I, in the wake of the destruction and famine that came with that, Bolshevik aggression, and etc., to Ronald Reagan and John Paul II's cooperation and cooperative actions to free Poland and the broader world in the wake of communist oppression, to the rebuilding of a Polish market economy after the fall of communism, and to the folding of post-communist Poland into NATO, and to our current fight in defense of Western civilizational values against Russian aggression. Poles and Americans have always found themselves shoulder to shoulder in a way that I don't think many other people in Europe have. We value our freedom and sovereignty, the role of faith in our national life. Dedication to these values can never be erased despite the efforts of those that might try. All of this is the most important reason why I love to visit Poland. We face unprecedented challenges today, some external like Russia, some internal. And the world, however, as troubled as a place as it now is, needs what the Polish-American relationship historically represents. And I'm convinced that if we stay true to our values, if we continue to stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of those values, we can meet the challenges that we face, dire as they are. Now, I hope I didn't put you all to sleep. And I think we have some time for questions.